More than a glorified handyman, Dean, and everyone in this room finally sees it. In front of 300 employees, CEO Vanessa Sinclair fired Dean Foster, a single father whose badge read nothing but technical consultant. Dean did not argue. He carried his box out into the rain, pulled a garage photo from the recycling bin, and called Ruth Bennett with 4 words, "Fire all of them." Vanessa believed she had just erased the only man who could stop her $900 million sale. She had no idea that phone call had just detonated a plan 11 months in the making, and that she now had 6 hours left before she lost everything she thought was hers. So who is Dean Foster really? Before the walkout even starts, if you have not already, tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Now here is how Dean Foster took his company back. Dean Foster measured his mornings by pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Every weekday at 6:45, he stood in the kitchen of his house on the edge of Detroit pouring batter into a skillet while his 5-year-old son Eli sat on the counter stool announcing which dinosaur he wanted that day. Grace had been gone for 4 years now, taken by an illness that moved faster than anyone expected. And in the space she left behind, Dean had rebuilt his entire life around getting Eli to school by 8 and being home again by 3:15 in the afternoon. Nothing about those hours looked like the life of a man who owned 62% of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At Foster Precision Group, the aerospace and medical device manufacturer, his own father, George Edward Foster, had started in a rented garage decades earlier. Dean was known simply as the technical consultant who walked the production floor in a canvas jacket checking tolerances on machined parts and troubleshooting equipment nobody else wanted to touch. His badge read, contractor. New hires assumed he was somewhere between a mechanic and a ghost, a quiet man who appeared in the shop before anyone else and vanished before the after-work drinks started. None of them knew that 4 years earlier, in the worst months of his grief, Dean had walked into a board meeting and asked the company to hire someone else to run it. That someone had been Vanessa Sinclair. She arrived with a resume built for magazine covers, a talent for growth numbers, and a story about herself that she told so often it had started to feel true even to the people who knew better. Her mother had spent 30 years as a secretary for men who took credit for her ideas, and Vanessa had built her entire adult life around one private vow: she would never again be the person doing the work in a room where someone else got to stand at the podium. That hunger for recognition had once made her brilliant. Lately, it had started to curdle into something closer to entitlement, a quiet conviction that the company Dean built was really hers because she was the only one anyone actually saw running it. When Dean handed her the company, he had also done something no one at Foster Precision besides one person understood. He placed his controlling shares into a family trust called the G.E. Foster Trust, named after his father George Edward Foster, and structured to protect Eli's inheritance no matter what happened to him. Dean named himself the sole trustee. To the board that approved it, exhausted from watching him fall apart after Grace's death, it seemed like a grieving father quietly stepping back. Nobody imagined he intended to stay gone this long, and by the time Vanessa's tenure hardened into something resembling ownership, most of the board members who remembered the arrangement had already retired or been replaced by people she had personally recruited. Only one person on the entire floor knew who Dean Foster actually was. Ruth Bennett had worked in the company's finance department since the garage days back when payroll was calculated by hand, and Dean's father still swept the floor himself at closing time. Ruth never once called Dean by anything other than his first name, not even in private, because she understood something. Dean was only beginning to learn the hard way. A secret survives only as long as the people who keep it treat it like one. She watched him disappear into the role of consultant with the same steady patience she brought to a set of books that did not balance, waiting for the day the numbers would eventually tell her something true. The first signs that something had shifted arrived quietly enough that Dean almost let them pass. A framed photograph from the original garage showing a much younger Dean standing beside a welder named Tommy Reyes in front of their first machine disappeared from the main lobby. Dean found it weeks later face down in a cardboard box labeled Archive, as though someone had simply run out of patience for a story that did not center Vanessa. Around the same time, the orientation video for new employees stopped mentioning a founder at all, describing the company instead as the creation of a group of local tradesmen that Vanessa Sinclair had transformed into a national name. The apprenticeship program for trade school students, which had carried Dean's father's name since its founding, was quietly renamed the Sinclair Fellows Program. Dean told himself a photograph and a name were not the company itself. He had made peace with invisibility a long time ago, and he was not going to let his pride pick a fight that his son did not need him fighting. That peace lasted until the quarterly operations meeting when Vanessa proposed switching to a new titanium supplier offering materials 18% cheaper than their current vendor. The catch, buried 3 slides into her presentation, was that the new material lacked 2 of the durability certifications required for components used in surgical implants. Dean spoke up in a room where he almost never spoke, explaining as plainly as he could that a hairline fracture in the wrong component could fail inside a patient's body without warning. Vanessa let him finish. Then she smiled at the assembled managers and told them that Dean was, after all, only a machinery consultant, and that certifications like these were exactly the kind of legacy cost she was always having to justify to the board. A few people laughed because they were afraid of her. Others studied the table in front of them rather than meet Dean's eyes. Dean did not argue with her in the room. He simply opened his notebook and wrote a single word inside it: drift. That night, he quietly asked the quality department to run an independent review of the new titanium shipment, and then sat alone in his small shared office, studying invoices Vanessa had personally approved over the past year. One name kept appearing in amounts just large enough to matter and just small enough individually to avoid attention. Meridian Advisory Group paid $30,000 every month for consulting services that produced no reports, no deliverables, and as far as Dean could find, no actual employees. When he traced the company's registration, the address led back to Vanessa's younger brother, Julian Sinclair. The total already exceeded $1 million. This was no longer a story about a woman quietly erasing a man's name from a lobby wall. Someone was pulling money out of a company that still legally belonged to Dean and to his son. And Dean understood immediately that the titanium decision had not been an isolated failure of judgment. It was a symptom of something being built underneath the company's foundation, one invoice at a time, by someone who had learned exactly how much visibility a person needed to avoid before anyone thought to look closely. Dean met Ruth privately the following week and asked her to begin quietly preserving records. He wanted original invoices, timesheets, vendor contracts, approval emails, market rate comparisons, and any documentation of profit adjustments that seemed inconsistent with the company's real performance. Everything needed a date, a duplicate copy, and a location outside the company's own servers. Ruth did not ask what Dean intended to do with any of it. She only asked how far back he wanted her to look. Dean told her to go back until they found the beginning. While the two of them quietly built their case, Vanessa continued dismantling what remained of Dean's presence. His badge access to certain restricted areas was suddenly revoked without explanation, and a security guard who had known Dean for over a decade had to apologize while issuing him a visitor badge instead. Employees who had once pushed back on Vanessa's decisions found themselves demoted or reassigned to positions with no access to financial systems, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Weeks into their quiet investigation, Ruth discovered a confidential file that appeared on a shared drive for less than an hour before someone deleted it. She photographed every page before it disappeared. The file was labeled Project Crown, and what it described made both of them understand exactly how much time they no longer had. Vanessa was negotiating with an investment firm called Holloway Capital to sell a controlling stake in shares held by a family trust. The same trust that, though neither Ruth nor Dean said it aloud, yet clearly belonged to Dean's own family. The buyers believed the trust had no active manager at all, an impression Vanessa had carefully cultivated by presenting it to Holloway as an unmanaged asset left behind after a widow's death, ripe to be pressured into an undervalued sale. Dean found evidence that Vanessa was simultaneously inflating fabricated expenses, signing contracts deliberately priced below profitability, suppressing the company's real value on paper and preparing a mass layoff timed to make the company look like it desperately needed rescuing. To anyone watching from the outside, Foster Precision would soon look like a company in crisis, exactly the story Vanessa needed to justify selling it away at a fraction of its worth. At this point, only one piece of the picture remained hidden even from Ruth. She knew the trust was tied to Dean's family in some deep and personal way, but she did not yet know who controlled it or how much of the company that person actually owned. Dean chose not to tell her yet, not out of mistrust, but because some truths were safer carried alone until there was a plan strong enough to hold their weight. Dean faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could confront Vanessa publicly and immediately, but she controlled the servers, the narrative, and a board that barely remembered his name existed on any document more official than a visitor log. A public accusation without ironclad proof would let her erase the evidence overnight and repaint him as a bitter, unstable contractor lashing out at a successful executive. Or he could keep pretending to be exactly what she believed him to be: harmless, quiet, and beneath her notice. Dean chose silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of a man building a case brick by brick, invoice by invoice, waiting for the moment Vanessa would least expect the ground beneath her to move. That night, he sat at his kitchen table long after Eli had fallen asleep, spreading printed pages across the surface where his son usually did his coloring homework. He thought about his father, who had built the company's first machine with borrowed tools and a welding torch that only worked half the time, and about Grace, who had once sat at this same table double-checking the numbers on the company's very first payroll before either of them believed it would survive its second year. Dean understood that the quiet life he had chosen after her death was never meant to be a hiding place. It was meant to be a shelter, one he had built carefully enough that Eli would never have to know how close it came to collapsing. I thought, too, about the version of himself who had once run every meeting in this building, who had known every employee's name before Vanessa ever learned the layout of the parking lot. That man had disappeared so completely that even Dean sometimes forgot he still existed underneath the canvas jacket and the visitor badge. Looking at the evidence in front of him now, at the shell companies and the falsified invoices and the quiet theft of a legacy that was never Vanessa's to take, Dean understood that disappearing further was no longer an option. Somewhere between the titanium meeting and the discovery of Meridian Advisory Group, the man his father raised had started waking back up. He closed his notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and checked on Eli one last time before going to bed, himself already turning over in his mind exactly how long it would take Ruth to find the beginning of a story someone else had worked very hard to erase. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that only Dean and Ruth understood. By morning, he was still the quiet consultant in the canvas jacket, walking the floor and fixing machines that had nothing wrong with them, just to have a reason to be near the right filing cabinets. By night, after Eli was asleep and the house had gone still, Dean sat with Ruth in her small kitchen 2 streets over, building a case 1 page at a time inside a blue ledger that never once touched the company's own servers. The ledger grew heavier every week. Invoices from Meridian Advisory Group were laid beside real market rates for consulting work, showing a gap too wide to explain as generosity. A warehouse the company paid rent on turned out when Ruth drove past it herself on a Saturday afternoon to be nothing more than an empty parking lot with a chain-link fence and a faded sign. Purchase orders had been approved outside the normal chain of signatures. Contracts were priced just low enough to bleed the company slowly, and money moved through a string of shell companies that all seemed to end eventually at the same family name. The clearest piece came from an email Ruth found buried in a folder that was never meant to survive a routine cleanup. Julian had written to his sister with a warning dressed up as reassurance, telling her to keep everything quiet until the trust was settled, because after that, nothing else would matter. Dean read the message 3 times before closing his laptop, understanding for the first time just how far the two of them were willing to go, and how little time might be left before Holloway Capital finished whatever Vanessa had promised them. Dean brought in Margaret Boone, soon after, a calm and precise attorney who had handled small pieces of the family trust's paperwork over the years, without ever knowing how large the stakes had quietly become. Margaret listened to everything Dean laid out across her desk with the same even expression she might have used reviewing a lease agreement, and when he finished, she told him plainly that he was still not ready to act. Vanessa had a legal team control of every internal system and the loyalty of a board that had mostly never heard Dean's real name. One misstep now could let her frame him as the one stealing from the company instead of the other way around. Margaret asked Dean a question that stayed with him longer than he expected. She wanted to know how many board members currently serving even knew his name belonged to anyone other than a contractor on the shop floor. Dean did the math out loud slowly and realized the number was smaller than he had let himself admit. Most of the people who had approved his quiet exit 4 years earlier were gone, replaced one seat at a time by executives. Vanessa had personally courted people who owed her their positions and had no memory of a founder who once ran the place from behind a welding bench. That single fact reframed everything for Dean. This was not simply a matter of proving what Vanessa had done. It was a matter of proving who he was to people who had never known him as anything but invisible, and doing it with evidence so complete that no one in that room would have room left to doubt it. Margaret told him the only path forward was patience disguised as compliance, letting Vanessa believe she had already won, while the two of them quietly finished building the one thing she could not talk her way around. Margaret's caution turned out to be justified faster than any of them expected. Vanessa noticed unusual activity in the company's older financial records within weeks, the kind of quiet digital footprint left behind by someone pulling files late at night. She responded by ordering an audit of every computer in the finance department, restricting Ruth's access to several shared drives and instructing the security team to start logging anyone who badged in after regular hours. The net was tightening long before Dean and Ruth had enough evidence to be safe from it. One evening, an IT technician arrived to inspect Ruth's workstation nearly an hour earlier than scheduled, catching her in the middle of copying the last batch of files onto a drive she kept hidden in her purse. Dean, watching from the shop floor camera feed on his phone, deliberately triggered a fault in one of the production line motors, sending an alarm through the building loud enough to pull the entire IT team away to troubleshoot it. By the time they returned to Ruth's desk, she had already closed everything and was typing an unrelated spreadsheet with the calm of someone who had done far riskier things in her life than this. Vanessa was not finished, though. She called Ruth into her office the following morning and, in a voice pitched somewhere between concern and threat, reminded her how easily a woman close to retirement could lose her pension over something as simple as removing company documents without authorization. Ruth sat through the entire conversation without blinking, nodding at all the right moments, letting Vanessa believe the warning had landed exactly as intended. She thanked her for the reminder, walked back to her desk, and kept going anyway, telling Dean later that fear only works on people who still believe they have something left to protect that matters more than doing the right thing. The investigation was not the only thing quietly reshaping Dean's life. He nearly missed Eli's kindergarten dinosaur presentation one Thursday afternoon because he had been in the middle of securing a backup copy of financial records that could not wait until the next day. By the time he arrived, breathless and still smelling faintly of machine oil, Eli was already standing alone at the edge of the little stage, glancing again and again toward the empty folding chair that was supposed to be his father's. On the drive home, Eli asked quietly whether the machines needed his father more than he did. Dean did not have an answer ready, and the question sat in the car with them the rest of the way home, heavier than anything in the blue ledger. He recognized uncomfortably the shape of an old mistake trying to repeat itself, the same slow drift that had once cost him months of Eli's early childhood, while he buried himself in grief and spreadsheets after Grace died. Whatever he was building now to protect his son's future could not come at the cost of his son's present. Dean pulled the car over before they reached the house, turning around in his seat so Eli could see his face clearly. He told his son that nothing in any building mattered more than the two of them, and that if he was ever late again, it would not be because a machine needed him more, but because he was working to make sure nobody could ever take away the things that belonged to their family. Eli considered this with the serious expression he reserved for questions about dinosaurs and space, then asked if the bad machine had been fixed. Dean told him it had, even though the machine he meant had never been broken at all. That night, after Eli had finally fallen asleep clutching a plastic stegosaurus, Dean sat outside his door for a long while, listening to the small, even sound of his breathing. He promised himself quietly and without ceremony that every late night from here forward would come with a plan attached, a clear stopping point, a reason he could explain to himself in the morning. The company had already cost him 4 years of pretending not to be who he was. He was not going to let it cost him the version of Eli that only existed once. The call from Margaret came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. A courier had delivered a signed voting proxy to her office, a document declaring that the family trust had granted Vanessa Sinclair full authority to vote in favor of